The Letter, the Witch, and the Ring by John Bellairs. Chapter 5. Mrs. Zimmerman rubbed her eyes. Around her lay the rumpled bedclothes, and at the foot of the bed stood Rosarita, who looked stunned. "Good heavens, Rosarita!" exclaimed Mrs. Zimmerman. "Is this some kind of new game? What on earth are you doing here?" Rosarita's head was awhirl. She began to wonder whether she might be losing her mind. She had been sure, absolutely sure, she had seen someone moving about near the head of Mrs. Zimmerman's bed. "Gee, I'm sorry, Mrs. Zimmerman," she said. "I'm really awfully sorry. Really, I am. I thought I saw somebody in here." Mrs. Zimmerman cocked her head to one side and curled up the corner of her mouth. "My dear," she said dryly, "you have been reading too many Nancy Drew novels. What you probably saw was my dress on this chair. The window was open, and it must have been fluttering in the breeze. Now go back to bed, for heaven's sake. We need some more shut-eye if we're going to go gallivanting all over the Upper Peninsula tomorrow." Rosarita stared at the chair that stood next to Mrs. Zimmerman's bed. A purple dress hung limply from the chair's back. It was a hot, still night. Not a breath of air was stirring. Rosarita did not see how she could possibly have mistaken the dress on the chair for somebody moving around in the room. But then what had she seen? She didn't know. Bewildered and ashamed, Rosarita backed toward the door. Good night, Mrs. Zimmerman," she stammered. I'm really sorry I woke you up." Mrs. Zimmerman smiled kindly at Rosarita. She shrugged her shoulders. "It's okay, Rosie. No harm done. I've had some pretty wild nightmares in my time. Why, I remember one, but never mind. I'll tell you some other time. Good night now, and sleep tight." "I will." Rosarita turned out the light and went back to her own room. She lay down on the bed, but she didn't go to sleep. She put her hands up behind her head and stared at the ceiling. She was worried. First there had been that photograph, and now this. Something was happening. Something was going on. But she couldn't for the life of her figure out what. And then there was that business of the break-in at Ole's farm, and the empty ring box. Did that have anything to do with what had happened tonight? Rosarita thought and thought, but she didn't come up with any answers. It was like having 2 or 3 pieces of a large and complicated jigsaw puzzle. The pieces didn't make any sense all by themselves. Rosarita figured that Mrs. Zimmerman must be as worried as she was. In fact, she was probably more worried since the strange things were happening to her. Of course, Mrs. Zimmerman would never let on that she was upset. She was always ready to help other people, but she kept her own problems to herself. That was her way. Rosarita bit her lip. She felt helpless, and she had a strong feeling that something really bad was going to happen soon. What would it be? That was another thing she didn't know. Next day, toward evening, Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita were bumping along a rutty back road about 20 miles from the town of Ironwood. They had been driving for about an hour on this road, and now they were ready to turn back. Mrs. Zimmerman wanted Rosarita to see an abandoned copper mine that had once belonged to a friend of her family. At every turn on the road she'd expected to see it, but the mine never appeared, and now Mrs. Zimmerman was getting discouraged. The road was just plain awful. Bessie jounced and jiggled so much that Rosarita felt as if she were inside a mixmaster. Every now and then the car would go banging down into a pothole, or a rock would fly up and hit the underside of the car with a sound like a muffled bell. It was another hot day. Sweat was pouring down Rosarita's face, and her glasses kept getting fogged up. Sandflies buzzed in and out of the open windows of the car that kept trying to bite Rosarita on the arms, and she slapped at them till her arms stung. Excuse me. Finally, Mrs. Zimmerman put on the brakes. She turned off the motor and said, "Darn it all anyway. I did want to show you that mine, but it must have been on another road. We'd better turn back if we're going to..." Oh, Lord! Mrs. Zimmerman clutched the steering wheel and doubled over. Her knuckles showed white under her skin. Her face was twisted with pain. She clutched at her stomach. "My God!" she gasped. "I've never..." Excuse me. She winced and closed her eyes. When she was able to speak again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Rosarita." Rosarita was terrified. She sat on the edge of her seat and watched Mrs. Zimmerman. "Yeah, Mrs. Zimmerman, what's the matter? What happened? Are you okay?" Mrs. Zimmerman managed a feeble smile. No, I'm not okay, she croaked. I think I have appendicitis. Oh my gosh! Rosrita was in the fourth grade, a kid in her class had died of appendicitis. His folks had just thought he had a bad stomachache until it was too late. Then his appendix broke open and he died. Rosrita felt panicky. Oh my gosh, she said again. Mrs. Zimmerman, what are we going to do? We have to get me to a hospital, quick, Mrs. Zimmerman said. The only catch is... Oh, no, please, no. Mrs. Zimmerman bent over again, writhing with pain. Tears streamed down her face, and she bit her lips so hard that it bled. The only catch, Mrs. Zimmerman gasped when she could talk again. The only catch is I don't think I can drive. Rosrita sat perfectly still and stared at the dashboard. When she spoke, her lips barely moved. I think I can, Mrs. Zimmerman. Mrs. Zimmerman closed her eyes as another wave of pain swept over her. What did you say? I said I think maybe I could drive. I learned to once. Rosrita was not exactly telling the truth. About a year ago, she had gone to visit a cousin of hers who lived on a farm near New Zebedee. He was 14, and he knew how to drive a tractor. Rosrita had pestered him until he finally agreed to teach her how to shift gears and let the clutch in and out. He taught her on an old wrecked car that sat in the field near the farmhouse. And after he showed her the ropes, Rosrita practiced by herself until she had all the gear positions straight in her head. She had never actually been behind the wheel of a moving car, or even a car that just had its motor running. Mrs. Zimmerman said nothing. She motioned for Rosrita to get out of the car. When she did, Mrs. Zimmerman dragged herself over into the seat where Rosrita had been slumped there against the door. With her hand on her stomach, Rosrita walked around and got in on the driver's side. She shut the door and sat there, staring at the wheel. She was afraid, but a voice inside of her said, "Come on, you've got to do it." "She can't, she's too sick. Come on, Rosrita." Rosrita slid forward until she was sitting on the edge of the seat. She would have moved the seat up, but she was afraid it would hurt Mrs. Zimmerman. And I should pause here to explain, in case those of you listening have not been in a car like this. This is 1950, so cars did not have bucket seats. So Rosrita and Mrs. Zimmerman are sharing a bench seat. That's how Mrs. Zimmerman was able to slide over. And this car would be a stick shift, not an automatic car like you're probably used to. So anyway, that's just a little bit of information from Kent Kentley, and now back to the story. Rosrita slid forward until she was sitting on the edge of the seat. She would have moved the seat up, but she was afraid it would hurt Mrs. Zimmerman. Fortunately, Rosrita was tall for 13, and she had grown a lot in the past year. Her legs were long enough for her to reach the pedals. Rosrita tapped the accelerator cautiously. Could she really do it? Well, she'd have to try. Mrs. Zimmerman had left the car in first gear, but you couldn't start a car when it was in first gear. It had to be in neutral. At least, that was what Rosrita had heard from her cousin. Cautiously, she pushed the clutch pedal in and eased the lever up into neutral. She turned the ignition key and the car started instantly. Now, with her right foot on the gas and her left foot on the clutch, she pulled the gear shift lever forward and down. Slowly, she began to let the clutch out the way she had been taught to do it. The car shuddered and the engine killed. "You've got to give it the gas," Mrs. Zimmerman gasped. "When you let the clutch out, give her the gun." "Okay." Rosrita was tense and trembling all over. She put the car back in neutral and started it up again. This time, when she let the clutch out, she really floored the gas pedal. The car took a little jump forward and stopped again. Apparently, too much gas was just as bad as too little. Rosrita turned to ask Mrs. Zimmerman what to do, but Mrs. Zimmerman had passed out. She was on her own. Rosrita gritted her teeth. She was getting mad now. "Okay, we're going to try again," she said in a quiet, firm voice. She tried again. The motor killed. It killed the next time, too, but the time after that, she managed somehow to let the clutch out and press the gas pedal at just the right rate. The car moved slowly forward. "Yay, Bessie!" Rosrita yelled. She yelled so loud that Mrs. Zimmerman opened her eyes. She blinked and smiled feebly when she saw the car was moving. "Atta girl, Rosie," she whispered. Then she slumped over sideways and lost consciousness again. Somehow, Rosrita managed to get the car turned around and headed toward Ironwood. It was dark now when she had to turn the lights on. The road was totally deserted. No farms, no homes. Rosarita remembered one ruined shanty that they had passed, but it didn't seem likely that there was anyone living in it. No, unless a car happened to come along, there would be no help until they reached the 2-lane blacktop that led back to Ironwood. Rosarita swallowed hard. If she could just keep the car going, maybe everything would turn out all right. She glanced quickly at Mrs. Zimmerman. She lay slumped against the door. Her eyes were closed, and every now and then she would moan faintly. Rosarita clenched her teeth and drove. On Bessie crawled, up and down hills, over bumps and rocks, and in and out of potholes. Her pale headlight beams reached out before her into the night. Moths and other night insects fluttered past. Rosarita felt as if she were driving along in a dark tunnel. Dark pine trees lined the road on either side. They seemed to press forward, until Rosarita felt hemmed in. An owl was hooting in the woods somewhere. Rosarita felt lonely and frightened. She wanted to drive fast, to get out of this awful place, but she was scared to. The road was so bumpy that she was afraid to speed up. It was frightening to have a big, heavy car under her control. Every time the car hit a pothole, the wheel lurched violently to the right or the left. Somehow, though, each time Rosarita managed to get straightened out. "Oh, please," she prayed, "get us there, Bessie. Please get us there before Mrs. Zimmerman dies. Please." Rosarita was not sure when, but after she had driven along the dark, winding road for some time, she began to have the feeling that there was someone else in the car with them. Rosarita didn't know why she had this feeling, but it was there, and it was very persistent. She kept glancing up toward the rearview mirror, but she never saw anything. After a while, the feeling got to be so maddening that Rosarita stopped the car. She put it in neutral, pulled the emergency brake, and as the car throbbed, she turned on the overhead light and glanced nervously into the back seat. It was empty. Rosarita flipped off the light, put the car back in gear, and drove on. But the feeling kept coming back, and she found that it took a strong effort of will to keep her eyes from wandering toward the rearview mirror. The car was rounding a sharp curve when Rosarita happened to glance up, and she saw, reflected in the mirror, the shadow of a head and 2 glaring eyes. Rosarita screamed and jerked the wheel violently to the left. With a screech of tires, Bessie swerved off the road and plunged down a steep bank. The car bounced and jounced wildly, and Mrs. Zimmerman's inert body slammed first against the door and then slid over across the seat to bump against Rosarita. Rosarita, panic-stricken, clutched the wheel and kept trying to find the brake with her foot, but she kept missing it. Down into the darkness they went. Now there was a loud swishing, crackling sound outside the car and a funny smell. In the fevered whirling of her brain, Rosarita found herself wondering, what is that smell? The crackling and swishing got louder, and finally Rosarita got her foot on the brake. Her body lurched forward and her head hit the windshield. She blacked out. And that's the end of chapter 5.